specializing in life transitions, home care, and the senior living industry.
And I'm Corrie Matt, a clinical social worker and psychotherapist, author of Someone Died, Now What? Matt, you reminded me, because I didn't remember, but I want to remind you that this past Tuesday, was National Caregiver Day.
Yeah, it was. It's authorized by the Canadian government nationally. So, as you know, Corrie, we talk a lot about caregivers that are dear to our hearts. I think so many people are caregivers, and we wanted to acknowledge them. And in fact, even on this segment, that we're going to be talking a little bit more about them.
So thank you for the great segue. Let's talk about the fact that home care requirements start to increase as the population ages. Makes sense. And it can be very challenging for caregivers. In fact, 1 in 4 Canadians are considered caregivers. Sometimes it simply becomes too much at home because of the risk. And of course, that caregivers can become sick, which can exacerbate the problem. Matt, I know that you do this for a living. You see it so much in your line of work. So I thought that why not better than today to have a discussion with you about your perspective about this, as well as, I said it earlier, equally important. There's a tremendous guilt of potentially transitioning a loved one to a more appropriate care environment. So welcome, Matt Del Vecchio, to Life Unrehearsed.
Thank you.
So let's start with, what are some of the warning signs that it might be time to transition from a home into a more appropriate environment?
Yeah, there's several important factors, and we break it down into a few of them, starting with physical. So if you're at home and there starts to be some mobility issues, stairs might be difficult to navigate, getting in and out of the bathtub is more challenging. There's increased risks of slips and falls. So some of the physical challenges, even getting dressed, putting on socks and shoes, become challenging. Cognitive is another important one, a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more challenging. This is when perhaps there's a little bit forgetfulness, forgetting to pay bills, medication isn't taken at the right time or in the wrong quantities. There may even be some wandering issues and forgetting things to turn off the oven. And even hygiene is a result of some cognitive challenges as well. So physical, cognitive, another important one, Corrie, is caregiver stress. The person taking care of someone. So, this might be a spouse. It might be an adult daughter or an adult son, even grandchildren now. If it starts to be overwhelming for the caregiver or the family, that is another warning sign. And I think the most popular one, believe it or not, and we saw this a lot during the pandemic, is loneliness and isolation. If you are on your own, God forbid there was a death of a spouse, or you're just simply on your own, loneliness and isolation is a big factor, a big warning sign, because we do need that stimulation to be with people. So that's another important one.
So that's the voice of Matt Del Vecchio. You're listening to Life Unrehearsed. I'm Corrie Matt, and we're talking about why it may be time to move essentially when care becomes too much at home. So, Matt, if a family wants to delay the move to a senior community, what are some of your suggestions about supporting the caregiver at home?
Yeah, I hear this a lot. We want to stay at home. It's only natural to want to stay at home as long as possible. Unfortunately, we probably extend the stay at home a little too long, but I always get asked this question, what can we do? And it really depends on your actual family situation. Are there family members that can help out, that can chip in? It should not be necessarily the responsibility of one sole caregiver, all on that person's shoulder. That's not fair. So can there be other friends or families or relatives that can help out? And by the way, those would probably be temporary solutions. It's usually Band-Aid, but it will buy you a little bit more time. Now, above and beyond that, we do have our healthcare system. As we're seeing and hearing, it is a bit broken, as a lot of people can attest to, but you can go to your local CLSC, ask for an evaluation, and try to get some help at home through the CLSC. There are even programs called Chèque Emploi, where you could actually hire your caregiver and the government will pay you an allotted amount of dollars per hour. So if you can get help public, great. As we're hearing more and more, it's just never enough. So many families will top it off or go exclusively through some private home care. And there are many good home care agencies that are out there. They can go in. You're not locked into long contracts. There's usually some minimums either on a daily or a weekly basis, but know that they're there for help at home.
I love what you're saying, and I hope that everyone here is listening about knowing, I mean, the big message here, and we're going to continue talking about this, is you don't have to do it alone. It's reaching out that there's services available and you don't have to do it. So let me ask you that. However, if it becomes too much, if it simply becomes too much at home, what are some of the steps that should be taken to transition into the senior living community?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I just want to address that point of being alone. We see that so often, Corrie, both of us do, because again, it's natural. We want to do our absolute best. Hardly anyone has had formal caregiver training. You're thrown into the fire, kind of, and it just builds. And all of a sudden, you do find yourself alone. You're adapting, and you feel, I could do it. I'm strong. I was brought up this way. But try to ask for help. You know, it's absolutely crucial. Now, if it simply becomes too much, that's the first important step, to recognize that it is too much. You're drowning. And if it is becoming too much, you need to start reaching out for help. So if you do need to consider a senior living community, there are a few steps that need to be taken that you can take. One, you need to choose the most appropriate environment for not just today, but tomorrow. The way it works in Quebec, we have two types of senior living communities. There's long-term care. These are nursing homes. These are the CHSLDs, Centre d'Hébergement de Soins de Longue Durée. There's our long-term care. That is usually more than 3 hours of daily care. You are dependent on someone else to live your day-to-day activities. So long-term care is usually, generally speaking, more than 3 hours of care. If it's less than 3 hours, now we get into what we call RPAs, or retirement homes. RPA stands for Résidence Privée pour Aînés. Many more options in RPAs. And by the way, there's no public RPAs. Okay, so I want to distinguish between choosing a public option or going a private option, and some actually choose a combination of both. So public is only long-term care. There are only CHSLDs, or what they call RIs, or réseaux intermédiaires. In order to get into public long-term care, you need to get an evaluation. You must go through the CLSC. It's a bit of a process. It takes time. They're overloaded. Advocate. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. Try to get that evaluation done to see if your loved one will qualify for a public residence. If all goes well, it's a double-edged sword, right? If your loved one qualifies, then they will ask you which permanent bed, which residence would you like to go to, and you will be put on a waiting list for a permanent bed. Our healthcare system is stretched. The average waiting list could be 1, 2, even 3 years to get a permanent bed. And what happens is you go into a transition bed, which is out of your control. It's first come, first serve. And then you wait until a permanent bed opens up. If you want to go the private route, there are both private RPAs and there are also private long-term care homes. So why are people going private? One, if you don't qualify for long-term care, you need to go into an RPA. At that point, less than 3 hours of care. And there are many, many choices of private RPAs, assisted living, care floors. And you could also go into long-term care in private while waiting until you get a permanent bed in public. That is actually becoming more and more popular, right? Because these transition beds could be anywhere. So families want to be close geographically and near home. And in a language, ideally, you don't want to be, for example, in an area. If you're Anglophone and in an environment that's Francophone, you want to have your choice geographically. So those are kind of the options for you, both in public or in the private sector.
It's a ton of information. You always make it so understandable and clear, and there's lots of moving parts and pieces to it. Now, Matt, as you well know, we have to go out to traffic, but when we come back, we're going to talk about, Matt gave us a very clear definition and explanation of the process. However, there's the emotional piece, the guilt associated with having to make some of these decisions. So when we come back from traffic, we're going to hear about how you make those decisions and how you manage the guilt.
Life Unrehearsed, brought to you by Lianas Senior Transition Support, helping you navigate home care and senior residences.
Welcome back to Life Unrehearsed. I'm Corrie Sirota, along with my co-host Matt Del Vecchio, who happens to be my guest as well, and we're discussing how it might be time to move when care becomes too much at home and how to deal with the guilt, the denial, and the resistance when making those difficult decisions. Now, there's no question, Matt, that I can't even imagine how one goes about making that tough decision, but when it is time to move. So I would love for you to share with us some of your words of wisdom around how one goes about making those decisions.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most challenging aspects that I see, and because it's emotional, it's personal. I hear things, this is not in our culture. We just don't do this. We take care of our own, and they took care of me. Why shouldn't I take care of them? The visions of residences. The pandemic has been really tough, so it adds to the emotion of it all. So there's this tremendous guilt that happens. So there's no real cookie cutter answer, but you really need to try to take the emotion out of it and make the decision based on one of more rationality and facts. And I'll explain. I always like to break it down into different parts, which help you determine, okay, is it the right thing to do? So I look at 4 aspects. First, there's the safety and security. Is your loved one alone or with someone? And if alone, are there challenges? Is their safety and security at risk? Are there cognitive issues that are increasing? Even if you are living with a loved one, is it risky? Are there flight risks? Is that wandering we were talking about before? Is there risks in bathing and hygiene? So safety and security is one important point. Number 2, are you able to provide the proper care? We talked earlier about people kind of being thrown or thrust into this role of caregiver, and you're doing your best. But caregiving can be very, very challenging, both physically and cognitive. For example, some people are doing one-person transfers, helping to transfer from a chair or from a bed into a walker, and you just physically can't do that, or helping in and out of a bathtub. Cognitively, are you trained? Do you know how to deal with these memory care challenges? Perhaps there's more aggressiveness. Do you know how to distract? And sometimes it becomes very difficult there. The third point, are you getting the proper support? You're trying to do it on your own, as we mentioned before. I see this probably the most. I see burnout. I see caregiver stress. It becomes overwhelming to a point where it becomes perhaps some family issues, marital issues, even, we're talking about drug and alcohol abuse. It's just becoming too much. You have to step back and look at your situation. Is it too much? And finally, the 4th aspect, Corrie, is financial. Can you afford to do it at home? Great. But sometimes the care, the hours start to add up. I've seen some people spend $15,000, $20,000 a month on caregiving. And you really do have to look at, if you can afford it, great. If you can't, you have to look at it. People are quitting their jobs, taking career losses to caregive. So at the end of it all, if you can't honestly say to yourself, okay, it's no longer safe and secure, I can't provide the proper care, I'm not getting the support, or it's just costing too much, now you are taking the emotion out of it and you're making it a rational decision. And you can make that decision a little easier, understanding that, you've done your best. You've done your absolute best, but it's just simply too much. And it helps you with that decision. And by the way, don't be surprised if someone moves into a new residence and it's not as bad as you think. Okay, we hear these horror stories, but all of a sudden you're getting a good night's sleep. You're able to see your loved one every day, eat with them every day, and go back to your own home and have a good night's sleep. So a lot of the times we hear this, that it's the fear until it actually happens, and things actually aren't that bad after it happens.
Right. Well, that's it. You're listening to Life Unrehearsed. I'm Corrie Sirota, along with Matt Del Vecchio, and we're discussing how it might be time to move when care becomes too much at home. And also, Matt really outlined how to separate the emotional from essentially some very essential practical aspects. So how to deal with the guilt, denial, and resistance when it comes to making these difficult decisions about the transition. I would say that aside from all that, I imagine you also see a fair amount of resistance and denial from even the person themselves who needs to be placed, perhaps as well as the family. So how do you suggest families deal with that?
Yeah, it's also another tough one, Corrie. And you're right. Could be resistance and denial both from the individual that may need to move. A lot of the times it's family members. Even siblings will have differing views. One will be full denial, one will be full acceptance, and somewhere in between. So it is challenging. So I always like to say, start by planting some seeds, by having subtle conversations. No one wants to be forced to do anything. But plant some seeds, and how you do that is look for some trigger events, Corrie. So, for example, maybe there was a little trip or a fall at home. Okay, a little thing, nothing broken, no broken hip or broken ribs, but it was a little trip or fall. That's a trigger event. Maybe there was a hospitalization. Perhaps there was a friend or another family member that actually had to go through a transition. That could spark a conversation. You hear something on the news, you listen to a show like this on the radio. Oh, I heard someone on the TV or on the radio talking about. These are all trigger events that will allow you to have these subtle conversations to plant some seeds. And then a very important one is when you're dealing with denial and resistance, try to make it about you. If you are the caregiver, sometimes I hear, Ma, this will be good for you, or Dad, this is going to be good for you. That will not work in most cases.
Okay.
They don't want to hear it. It's patronizing. Most people think they are usually better than they actually are. So for them to hear, no, this is going to be good for you, trust us, no. Make it about yourself. So explain how this is affecting you day to day. Maybe you had to quit your job. Maybe you are just overwhelmed. Maybe you're becoming sick, especially if you're an adult children, you're the only child. There's the physical and emotional toll that is taking on you, and that will usually resonate a little bit better with your loved one.
I love what you're saying, Matt, because this whole concept of having using whether you say it's a trigger event or something separate and from you and the family, like even watching a television show or, like you said, listening to a radio show and saying, hey, this is what I heard, or an article you read, all of those ways where it's an indirect way of starting. It's just starting the conversation and seeing where it can go. I do think prevention is really important, and this is about starting those discussions, and that can be very preventative. We're almost out of time. I could talk to you forever. What's the state of senior residences these days?
Yeah, it's interesting because it is actually quite good. If there is a silver lining in this pandemic, we've never talked more about seniors' residences as a general population than ever before. There's been a microscope on this in the news and the media, mostly negative. Well, what that has done is, in my seniors world and senior residence world pre-pandemic, just things like infection prevention and control, the masks, the cleaning, the hygiene, the disinfecting, the hand sanitizing stations, that was there, but very little prior to the pandemic. Now it's all over the place. And I think the care now, everyone is very sensitive. The staff to resident ratios, don't get me wrong, we have a long ways to go, but it's improving. But we still have the state of elder care. We all have to push and advocate for more. And last thing I would say, there's COVID in the residences. But is that making the news? No, it's just like it's at home as well. So they're managing it much better. The degree of COVID is much less affecting in residents. So I think overall, we can't let our guard down. We have to push for more, but really not as bad as what people think.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. As always, you are a plethora of information.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And thank you for having me as a guest, Corrie. Really appreciate it. We want to thank our listeners for joining in here on Life on Rehearse. And as a reminder, for all your inquiries or assistance with either life transitions, elder care planning, and the senior living industry, it'd be my pleasure to help. You could look me up under Lianas Senior Transition Support. That's Lianas Senior Transition Support. Many thanks to our technical producer, Dean Bertoya. You did a fantastic job, Dean, under the gun. And you can listen to Life on Rehearse here on CJAD 800 every Saturday